Hey there everyone, it's Joel Reads Comics back again for another supercut. Punisher One Last Kill is hitting our app screens this week, so I thought, hey, you know what better time to continue the story of Frank Castle with Jason Aaron's Punisher series. This was a 12-issue maxi that was pretty damn controversial in its day. In fact, I think it still is controversial. I still, every so often, see people on like TikTok or everything say, oh, this was like the worst Punisher story ever. I know people absolutely reviled it at the time, which made zero sense to me because this is genuinely a really good story, and I can tell by people's complaints, the same recurring ones, that they probably either didn't read the book or did not read all of it, because most of the problems that they are talking about are literally addressed in the story. Hey, can you believe that Frank Castle was a killer as a kid? Yep, yes I can. Absolutely. Again, I love the Max series, and in the Max series they say all the time that Punisher would have become a killer anyway, whether he went to war or not. Only kind of makes sense. In fact, most of this story basically just canonizes things that people liked about the Max universe, whether it was stuff that Garth Ennis wrote, or particularly stuff that Jason Aaron wrote in his follow-up Max series. Furthermore, if you didn't like stuff about it, guess what? You don't have to worry, because they did the story, it didn't break it, and now Punisher is back to his regularly scheduled status quo in the Ben Percy book, which is also good. This is also a book that I know people didn't read because, hey, it deals with 2, maybe even 3 unreliable narrators. The Punisher, we don't actually hear his internal monologue for most of the book, which is pretty damn rare because this dude loves to internal monologue. There are so many ways out of this story, even right down to Lady Bullseye saying, hey, don't trust the Hand Archpriestess, she can mess with your memory, and yet so many people were willing to take everything that happened in this story as the gospel truth, and I think that's so wild because they miss what ends up being a super cool-ass story. Frank Castle getting a cool new costume and ninja powers and getting to punish on an absolutely industrial level. That's awesome. Punisher fighting Ares, the god of war, and Ares actually being kind of hurt that the Punisher joined forces with the Hand because he always thought that the Punisher was his greatest follower, his greatest prophet of war. That's excellent stuff, and you can only get it in this story. I think, too, a thing that made this story such a lightning rod for controversy is the socio-political commentary that Aaron is doing here. He doesn't do a lot of it, but it's implicit in the actual premise, and that is, hey, imagine if a group of evildoers out there literally tried to co-opt the Punisher in the same way real-world bad actors attempt to co-opt the Punisher skull symbol. Yeah, something to think about, right? I mean, it's right there in the text, but again, I've glad-standed and I've hot-dogged enough. Let's actually get to the story proper. Here's hoping that enough time has passed that people can maybe reevaluate this one, maybe change their minds, and if you don't like it, guess what? Next week we can do something different, so until then, everyone.
Why has Marvel's greatest anti-hero, Frank Castle, decided to join forces with the demon-worshipping ninja cult known as the Hand? Well, let's hop into Punisher #1, a brand new maxi series from Jason Aaron, and find out together, shall we? So then, as we join this much-hyped new book, we actually get treated to a flashback of the fateful day when Frank's wife and children were murdered in Central Park. It's a very familiar scene, but one with a new creative twist on it. You see, we don't actually witness the events through the eyes of the Castles. This time we see and hear everything through the eyes of passerbys and first responders. We learn that the 2 children died almost instantly from their wounds, but Maria Castle held on for a little longer. Keep that in mind because it may actually be important later. We also get a very nice collage of some of the Punisher's greatest moments from throughout comic book history, from his OG days following his debut in Spider-Man, his long strained relationship with other heroes like Daredevil, and of course the Garth Ennis Marvel Knights years, and even some of Aaron's own work on the Punisher, because yeah, this is actually Aaron's second time writing a solo Punisher book. I feel a lot of people have forgotten that. From there we jump to the present, where we meet a new group of villains calling themselves the Apostles of War. They're a band of Greek arms dealers who worship Ares and sell superhero killing weapons to villains all over the world. These dudes do know that Ares is like a guy in the Marvel universe who you can like talk to and touch. He also doesn't have the best track record ever, so I don't know why they worship him. Never been much for religion, I guess. The Apostles' operation comes under attack by the Punisher, who says he's been killing his way through these guys' customers list made up of anti-Wakandan warlords, international Hydra cells, and and even a new hate monger in Middle America. Now Frank is ready to take the fight to these guys directly while also showing off his brand new Japanese-inspired duds. Wow, Frank was deadly enough before, but now he studied the blade and has the power of anime on his side. A lot of people pissed and moaned about this new design. I'd argue it's no more or less silly than Space Punisher, Frankenstein Punisher, Fire Angel Punisher, or War Machine Punisher, which are all things that totally happened and all things that for some reason got left out of the nice little collage at the beginning of this book. The Punisher manages to shut down the weapons smuggling ring, but sadly he's nowhere closer to the Apostle's mysterious boss. If Frank is this scary, imagine how scary that guy must be that none of his goons wanted to turn against him. Frank and his new ninja buddies return to Hand HQ, which is a massive castle in a cursed forest that can only be found by those who have been there once before. You'll notice Frank hasn't actually had any narration in this issue. Instead, it's the Archpriestess of the Hand who's been doing all the talking. Basically, she says that she represents the oldest and most powerful branch of the Hand, the one born at the dawn of humankind when man first did violence against his fellow man, all in the name of the Beast, the Hand's ancient god. Who, again, if you read a lot of comics, you'll know, despite the Beast sounding super cool and super heavy metal, he also has probably one of the worst win-loss ratios of any villain out there. As we discover, leading the Hand has some unforeseen fringe benefits. Not only does the Punisher have access to the group's entire considerable war chest, but while he was away, the ninjas rounded up a bunch of the worst criminals they could find. Killers, rapists, child abusers, people who talk during movies, and the Punisher is free to punish them as he sees fit, while still going around the world and dealing with the Apostles. But of course, the big question still remains, how exactly did Frank hook up with the Hand? Well, for that, we travel back in time once again. It seems that the Punisher came back to his apartment one day only to get jumped by an entire crew of ninjas. The Archpriestess had heard tales of the Punisher and how he was very well the greatest mass murderer ever produced. She thought that he may be able to pass the Slayer's trial to become the group's new leader. In fact, she was so sure Frank was destined to do the will of the Beast, she quite literally bet her own life on it. What follows is a mostly dialogueless action scene wherein Frank kills ninja after ninja while also showing off that his apartment is 90% weapons. He's got knives in the refrigerator instead of food, a chainsaw in the broom closet, and some C4 charges under his bed. Honestly, I wish that bit kept going. Does he have cyanide capsules in his medicine cabinets? The Punisher wins the day, but understandably he tells the old hand lady to get bent when she tries to recruit him. After all, this isn't the first time a group of villains have tried to get him on their side, but Frank has always remained the lone wolf type. What's stopping him, though, from blowing this Archpriestess away might actually surprise you. You see, the Archpriestess is so dedicated to winning Frank over, she decided to bring a little peace offering. If you know anything about the Hand, they do a lot more than just assassinations. They have also been shown to be masters of resurrection via their dark magic. They brought Bullseye back to life, they brought Elektra back to life, they've brought all sorts of people back to life before, but this time, though, to really get under Frank's skin, they decided to bring back his wife Maria. So then, as this issue opens up, we get a very unexpected flashback to a young Frank Castle. Apparently, he was always a handful as a child, taken to violence, fighting. So much to the point he ended up getting sent to the school psychiatrist. You know, for a second here I was gonna say this flies in the face of everything we know about young Frank, or Francis Castiglione as his name used to be. But then I'm reminded that a lot of that comes from Garth Ennis Marvel Knight stuff that technically isn't in main universe continuity and never really was, so I guess Aaron is given a free pass to play with things just a little bit. Now, back in the present, Frank is still enjoying getting to reconnect with his newly resurrected wife, or at least I think he's enjoying it. Again, he doesn't really smile, and once again, for the second issue in a row, we don't actually get to hear Frank's own internal monologue. Apparently, Maria still isn't back to 100% yet and is taking medicine given to her by the Hand. Frank also doesn't want her going out anytime soon. And when Frank is asked about the fate of their children, he only says that they'll be coming home soon, which is a very cryptic comment to make. Now, in the previous issue, in his battle against the Apostles of Ares, you'll remember that the Punisher had started incorporating more ninja-esque tactics into his playbook. Frank has never been much of a sword fighter, and part of his role as the Hand's new leader, he actually goes out of his way to train with the men that he's ordering into battle. The Archpriestess of the Hand thinks that this is silly, that Frank is already one of the greatest killers ever to grace the earth, and he shouldn't have to do this, but Frank thinks if something is worth doing, it's worth doing right. It's also a good way to learn more about the Hand and the people serving under under him. In fact, when Frank finds out that most of these hand ninjas began lives as child soldiers, either sold into slavery or with no other options but to kill to survive, he demands that the Archpriestess stop recruiting children. Now, speaking of the Archpriestess, we actually learn a hell of a lot more about her in this issue. You'll recall that her faction of hand ninjas was called the Sickly Ones. They claim to be the oldest and most loyal worshippers of the Beast, the Hand's patron god. Here's an interesting thing though, in the past, whenever the Hand would pick an avatar, they were almost always a ninja, a kung fu master, or a samurai, someone, Asian. The Archpriestess believed that this was archaic thinking though, and that the only way the Hand would ever give birth to a new messiah of murder is if they thought outside the box, mainly if they went American. And I mean, as far as the Archpriestess sees it, the Americans have mastered the art of murder. Hell, they can't even go to the mall most days without shooting it up. The Archpriestess so thoroughly believed in this brand new course of action, she killed all of those who stood against her, and as we discover in another flashback, the Archpriestess has been watching over Frank for a very long time. As a boy, she asked him which knife was his, which might seem silly on the surface, but they actually give this test to people who they think may be reincarnations of the Dalai Lama in real life. Also, hey, remember in the last video I claimed that this story reminded me a lot of Secret Empire? Okay, this right here really reminds me of Secret Empire by retconning that even as children, our main character was being poised to take over a death cult. And hey, while we're on the subject of death cults, this town ain't big enough for two of them. The Hand are currently embroiled in an ongoing war with the Apostles of Ares, and an agent of Ares comes to High Slayer Frank Castle to try and break bread by offering up one of those brand new experimental Hulk-killing weapons. Obviously, Frank thinks this is absolutely stupid that this guy would come here and think that he could be bought off. Things take an even crazier turn too when this guy insinuates that at the end of the day, Frank Castle has always been an apostle of Ares himself. He prays to the god of war all the time, he just doesn't know it. Frank turns the table by saying he's never loved war in an abstract sense, he's only ever cared about his own personal war, and then things take a really crazy turn when we realize that Frank now has superpowers. As the Archpriestess explains, he has the sight of the beast, meaning that when he looks at this Ares guy, he can not only see all the sins he's committed, but all the sins he'll ever commit. I'd say somewhere Ghost Rider is upset about gimmick infringement, but it actually goes a step further when the Archpriestess says that the Punisher isn't just the High Slayer, he's the Fist of the Beast, the first in Millennium. A reincarnation of one of the Hand's greatest and most bloody killers not seen for thousands of years, and again, somewhere Moon Knight is starting to sweat. The High Priestess is even moved to tears at how amazing her plan has gone, and once again offers Frank a knife, only for him to make the proper choice this time. Now, what about the Apostles of Ares? As we check on in with them, they're doing a major gun deal with a local tong, only their leader is truly upset that these guys managed to use their weapons to scare their opponents into backing down from open war. After all, Ares himself, the god, does not care for money, only for bloodshed. And that if the Punisher and the Hand truly want a war, Ares will give them a war they'll never forget. So then, as we join the book proper, Frank Castle is leading his army of hand ninjas into battle against the forces of Hydra. Once again, narration duty is handled by the Archpriestess of the Hand. She says that in the beginning, God created man, but man quickly superseded God in the deadly arts. And perhaps there is no greater exemplar of this fact than Frank Castle, the Punisher, a man who long ago mastered the art of killing greater than any man who had ever come before him. The Archpriestess believes this is because Frank Castle at a very young age was anointed by the Beast, the Hand's unholy god of death and destruction. But believe it or not, the Archpriestess says that she didn't want Frank Castle to be their brand new High Slayer, their leader, just because she thought he was especially good at killing. It seems that she actively wanted the Hand ninjas to learn from Frank. Frank is slightly confused by this question, saying what exactly do they want to know? How to shoot a Skrull in a place that won't grow back? How to fight a man who can fly? Or even how to butcher a Hydra Hydra Nazi like he's doing right now. No, that's apparently not what the crowd of red-clad ninjas wants to hear at the moment. Instead, they want to hear the story of Frank Castle's first kill, the moment that the Punisher was truly born. And to tell that story, we're treated to yet another flashback to young Frank Castle. Now, I had complained in the previous issue that I felt this story didn't necessarily need any flashbacks, and that's because, as far as I'm concerned, the best Punisher origin story already exists. It's called Born. It just happens to be out of continuity. Well, here Aaron gives us a brand new in-canon origin story for the Punisher, one that actually draws a ton of reference from another Garth Ennis prequel story called The Tiger. We see a young Frank Castle in New York shooting bottles with his BB gun when he ends up becoming witness to a brutal slaying of a young couple at the hands of a local connected mafioso. No one exactly knows why the couple was murdered, but what Frank knows for sure is that everyone on the block heard and no one bothered to do anything about it. They all turned a blind eye and let injustice happen. If that sounds familiar to you, it should, because it's very similar to the very real New York slaying of Kitty Genovese. Read up on that if you want. This moment would end up having a fundamental effect on young Frank Castle. He just couldn't take that something this horrible could happen so close to home. It's at that moment a voice started screaming in his head, and the only way he thought about quieting it would be to punish the person responsible for it. It was very easy for Frank to get the tools he needed to get the job done. After all, people in the neighborhood stopped paying him any mind a long time ago. Other kids were scared of little Frank, and Frank long ago had stopped trying to tell people what he was really thinking. How does the proto-Punisher choose to end the life of this mafioso? Well, he goes full Home Alone on him by dumping a bucket of diesel on him and then setting him on fire with a hairspray flamethrower. And once again, everyone in the neighborhood heard this guy's screams, and yet no one did anything about it. No one even ever thought that Frank could possibly be responsible, and well, he's been killing people ever since, but not nearly enough, he says. A fact of which makes the Archpriestess and all the other ninjas basically frickin' swoon at the idea that this guy is their leader. It's around here too Frank gets done taking apart the Hydra grunt. Even though this dude took the torture and never actually said anything, it seems that Frank knows exactly what he was thinking. Just chop this up to yet another power offered to him by the Beast. Turns out this Hydra cell was also supplied with deadly weapons of mass destruction by the followers of Ares, meaning that Frank has yet another reason to go and pay these guys a visit. Before he can scramble his troops, though, the Archpriestess offers Frank a real King Solomon-style dilemma: two feuding ninjas who had taken out their anger on other people. Frank hears their case and then ends up killing both. The way he sees it, everyone in the hand is a murderer already, but they're not going to kill without his say-so. They're going to be bullets in his gun from now on. This is actually the first thing that Frank has said that seemingly makes the Archpriestess a little uncertain, as murder is the hand's most holy sacrament, and the Punisher wants to control how and when they can do it. Before Frank can take off on his next mission, though, he ends up hearing that his wife needs him out in the garden. She seemingly escaped her bonds and is now all manner of confused. In an actually pretty sad twist, she thinks that they just left their two children at the park and that they need to go get them. Oh, that's rough, and it also means that Frank is going to be staying behind and sending his hand ninjas to go deal with Ares. As you might have guessed, it does not go well for the rank-and-file ninja, as the god of war literally takes them apart with his bare hands. Furthermore, he's insulted that the Punisher would just send goons, meaning that this war between the followers of Ares and the Hand just went from strictly professional to totally personal. Now, after everything that happened with his wife, Frank is quite troubled, and it's here that the Archpriestess swoops on in once again to try and comfort him by saying that if Frank wants something, he needs only ask the Beast for it. After all, the Beast is the anti-god, where one created life and beauty, the other one created death and destruction. But that also extends to those who were dead already. The Beast can have them rise once again if only the Punisher wills it. And why, yes, as the comic comes to a close, that does indeed include his two children. So then, picking up directly from where the last issue left off, the Punisher had decided to flee the Hand's castle with his newly resurrected wife Maria, the idea being that he just could not stand what the Archpriestess had done in his name this time, mainly murdering the families of a bunch of Hand ninja grunts in hopes of recreating them in the Punisher's image. This served as a very much-needed wake-up call for Frank, who decided that he was going to slash his way out of this situation. It's also here in this issue we discover that the Hand Archpriest is the one who has been doing the internal monologues since this story began. Anne, the woman who for all intents and purposes is the main villain of this new series. Yeah, it turns out she's not actually human. It seems that much like the Beast, she too is some sort of horrifying lizard monster. Frank manages to cut her down, and you think the other ninjas are gonna jump on in and try and avenge her, only here's the thing, they don't. They still see Frank Castle as their leader, their high slayer, and well, if he thought the archpriestess had to die, then he must be right, because how could the hand of the Beast ever possibly be wrong? They just kinda let Frank and Maria go. They run off into the jungle. However, it's not long until Frank realizes that Maria can't really survive outside of Hand HQ. Her body and mind start deteriorating, but worse still, she actually ends up remembering the death of both herself and her children in the park all those many years ago. Of course, as we hear from the archpriestess in the internal monologue, she always assumed that something like this would happen, that even the most faithful will eventually doubt and turn away from their god. After all, why do you think the most successful religions in the world all seem to be built on a bedrock of fear? Fear of damnation, fear of excommunication. And the cult of the Beast is no different. This is also just one side of the story, as once again we are treated to another, what we now know to be doctored flashback to Frank Castle's youth. This time we get treated to the adventures of Frank Castle, juvenile delinquent. It seems after burning that guy to death in his neighborhood, Frank just couldn't take the pressure and started acting out at school. One day though, he ends up stepping in and saving a kid named Stedman from a bunch of bullies. Stedman, I've never heard that name outside of Oprah's boyfriend before. In Stedman, Frank actually finds something that he's never really had before, a friend, someone who truly cares about him. Stedman knows that Frank is dealing with a lot of pent-up anger and aggression, and he thinks he knows the perfect way for him to let it all out. Pee-wee hockey. A sport that not only condones savage, goonish violence, but also encourages it. Ah, Canada's pastime. You love to see it. You know, that's why we're so nice and polite, eh? We just let it all out on the ice, and then we're cool for the rest of the day. It's while playing hockey for the Devils, which almost certainly has to be a reference for Daredevil and his big long-standing history with the Hand, that Frank would come face-to-face with a young Maria. It was basically love at first sight. Well, actually, it was something much weirder than that. Maria actually reminds him of the dead woman that spurred him into his first murder, which might seem like a weird addition, but it all makes a lot more sense when you remember that this is just the archpriestess writing a story that she thinks will ultimately end with Frank wanting to lead the Hand. Believe it or not, Frank is actually too shy to talk to Maria. Again, isn't it funny? A guy who has no problem brutalizing people, knocking their teeth out, and making them bleed is actually afraid of one thing, and that thing is talking to a girl he likes. So instead, Frank's only friend Stedman decides that he's going to play wingman for Frank. He writes down a mushy love note and gives it to Maria, and wouldn't you know it, she ends up falling head over heels in love with Frank basically instantly. Eventually, Frank starts spending all of his time with Maria, and she's able to bring out a softer, kinder, gentler side of him that he never thought possible. The one downside, though, is he actually ends up pushing Stedman away. This means Stedman has to try and find new friends, and one night he ends up hooking up with a bunch of boys from the high school as they get drunk and steal a car. That car ends up crashing somewhere on the Jersey Turnpike, and Stedman is tragically killed. Also, he doesn't die instantly or anything. He bleeds out for 4 hours as the other boys leave him behind. This horrible tragedy ends up once again awaking the Punisher side of Frank. He goes on a one-man crusade to punish all of those boys, beating them to death with his bare hands. Unlike his last murder, though, this is hard for the news and police to ignore. It ends up becoming a major story in his small town, and Frank figures he has no choice but to run away and try and join the Marines. As he leaves, he places a call to Maria, and we're not sure if he's going to break up with her or just tell her what he's doing, but ultimately she drops a bomb on him by admitting that she's pregnant. But yeah, so long story short, Frank loves his wife so much that he's willing to actually go back to the Hand and the archpriestess if it means that maybe she can finally live for real outside the castle walls. Punisher swears that this is going to be a short arrangement. He's only going to be doing this until his wife is strong enough to leave, and then he's going to try and kill all of them all over again, probably. Again, the archpriestess knows what she's doing here. Yes, she's working on trying to help Maria live full time, but she's also filling her head with the doctored version of Frank's own personal history. The one that is making him more susceptible to manipulation. Also, this whole Maria problem is just one of many problems that Frank is dealing with. There's still also the followers of Ares, who choose now of all time to raid the Hand Castle. Ares himself
himself is again filled with all sorts of pomp and circumstance, saying that he has come not just to fight the Punisher, but to free his most beloved acolyte from the control of the Hand and the Archpriestess so that he may once again do the bidding of war. Ares seeks to remind Frank who he truly is, so much to the point that instead of wearing his own skull logo, Ares has decided to adopt the Punisher's classic design. So then, picking up from where the last issue left off, after multiple stories in a row of these two circling each other, Ares, the god of war, and Frank Castle, the new High Slayer of the Hand, are finally ready to meet in open combat. And after multiple issues in a row of talking Frank up as his greatest acolyte, a true son of war, Ares has to admit that he is quite disappointed with the Punisher that has come to meet him. A shadow of his former self resorting to using ninja trickery. But make no mistake, the Punisher did come to fight Ares one-on-one, which is actually much more in line with the Punisher that the god of war knows, a reckless, murder-happy individual who time and time again happily threw himself against insurmountable odds only to come out the other end completely fine, again almost as if like the god of war had been watching over him the whole time. Again, I think it's kind of interesting that Jason Aaron has chosen to give Frank Castle no actual internal monologue in this story, and that all the flashbacks we've seen up until this point setting up the Punisher's early years we know to actually be fake and doctored by the Hand High Priestess. In a way, you could argue Frank has literally lost control of the narrative of his own life, and he's being dragged in multiple different directions by powerful individuals, be it the Beast of the Hand or the God of War. Now, what's really cool about how Aaron chooses to write Ares is that despite being a giant, violence-loving musclehead, he's not actually dumb at all. In fact, he uses the fight as an excuse to try and size up Frank. He wonders what could make such a finely tuned killing machine turn on everything that he once held dear and completely change the way he goes about business. And eventually, Ares, through a process of elimination, figures out why Frank didn't want to actually meet him in the field of battle and why he's been hiding away in the Hand's castle, and that is because, well, Frank has something to fear now, something he's worried about losing. And because the Hand Ninja Clan is pretty damn famous for resurrecting the dead, it doesn't take an absolute genius to put together what exactly they're holding over Frank's head right now. And again, in a truly fun piece of characterization, Ares, who all throughout this story has seen himself as Frank's own patron and savior, vows that if his resurrected family is what's making him weak right now, then Ares will sacrifice this family on his altar so the Punisher can be returned to his former glory. Of course, that doesn't go well for anyone because, well, that's exactly what the Hand Priestess has been doing with Frank since bringing back his wife, the idea being that if he so greatly fears losing his family again, Frank will tap deeper and deeper into the power of the Beast to give him the extra edge in the battle, in doing so costing him more and more of his soul every time he does it. And indeed, these newfound Beast powers do give the Punisher an edge in the fight against Ares. The only problem is that it doesn't give him enough of an edge. Punisher is still new to the whole power thing, and well, Ares has been a god his entire life. Still though, Frank just narrowly manages to survive death at the hands of the God of War, and we're treated to yet another flashback, this time to Frank's time in Vietnam, or whatever war they're in. Again, the whole point of these flashbacks is that they're fake, and that Jason Aaron basically has a blank check to reimagine the character's history any way he wants, and both not only not be wrong, but not actually rub against any other pre-established continuity. In a way, it's actually kind of genius, making it so that Aaron's version of the Punisher only works for this story by Aaron himself. Again, if he wants to say that Frank killed a guy at 10, he did. If he wants to say he was a bit of a drinker, he can. Or like in this flashback where he says that Frank was only ever happy and content on the battlefield, and that even after his first child was born, he still had an overwhelming feeling of emptiness inside him. The Punisher survives his run-in with Ares just barely, thanks to the Hand Ninjas managing to scoop him up and the High Priestess filling him with enough potion so he can walk again. Though, as we quickly discover, the Punisher is not concerned about his own life, he's concerned about the lives of his children, who the Hand have been hard at work trying to resurrect. Frank, of course, fears that if Ares and his acolytes come here to finish the fight, his children could easily end up dying all over again, not to say what they're doing now is really what you could call living. As the High Priestess explains, resurrecting dead children is always a problem, even for dark magics that belong to the Beast. There's just something about people being dead for longer than they were alive. And every time the Hand does try and bring the two kids back
back to life, they're reborn as horrifying homunculuses. And hey, if you think that's really gross and dark, you ain't seen nothing yet, because it's also implied that Frank won't let the ninjas hurt his children, which means that when he puts them out of their misery, he himself personally puts them out of their misery every single time. A task so unbelievably horrible that it actually brings the Punisher to throwing up in absolute disgust with himself, which we do not see very often. It's while throwing up and cursing his own reflection that Frank Castle ends up coming face to face with an old friend, Matt Murdock Daredevil. Yeah, if you've been reading the Daredevil book, you'll know that Matt has actually joined forces with Elektra to create a brand new organization called the Fist for the whole purpose of bringing down the Hand once and for all. Which means that Frank and Matt, two guys who never saw eye to eye at the best of times, are now on a bloody collision course. So then, once more as we join this series, we are treated to another one of the Hand Archpriestess's doctored memories of Frank's life. Well, really, it's more of a story about Maria and her life as it relates to Frank. Normally, I'd complain from a narrative point of view, saying, hey, how does Frank remember all that stuff he wasn't there for? But again, we don't have to ask those questions because all of these memories are fake and only being used by the Hand to better manipulate Frank into being their High Slayer. I'd also be lying if I said I didn't think it was very fascinating to see someone like Jason Aaron actually try and create a character for Maria Castle who never really got one before outside of just, corpse. It's in these flashbacks we discover that Maria was actually a devout Catholic, which, I mean, come on, with a name like that, are you really surprised? We also learn via her confession she has been afflicted with terrifying nightmares, imagining the devil at her doorstep not long after Frank returned from the war. And again, you don't need to be a genius to see the symbolism at work here. Aaron also goes a step further and answers the question, well, if Maria was so scared of Frank, why didn't she just leave him? Well, she believed deep in her heart of hearts that she could save him, that he was a man afflicted with a lot of really undiagnosed PTSD following the war. Again, which war, it doesn't matter. People also kept telling her that Frank was a good man, that he saved them when they needed it the most. Mostly it was former soldiers that Frank had served with. And eventually, after a while, even the two kids started to warm up to him too. Now, back in the present, you'll remember at the end of the previous issue, Daredevil had actually come to the Hand's inner sanctum to try and find Frank. Obviously, Matt is all sorts of pissed at Frank right now, saying that he's gone too far, that he might think that he's using the Archpriestess and the Hand, but really at the end of the day, he's the one being manipulated. What really sticks in Daredevil's craw, though, is the fact that he saw Frank bury his zombified children again, who the Hands seem unable to resurrect, and he knows full well that Frank is keeping zombie Maria in a tower. That, more than any moral failing, is what really ends up striking a major nerve with Frank. Don't talk about my family, Matt, and also if we're gonna start comparing spouses, how many times has Elektra, world-renowned assassin, come back from the dead? Aren't you and her married right now and playing Ninja Clan yourself? Of course, as we've seen time and time again throughout this series, Frank's desperate need to try and protect his wife from dying all over again is ultimately what feeds the beast inside him. Which means he's basically stuck in a never-ending vicious cycle. He feels guilty about what happened to his family and how he couldn't save them, and so because of that, he's tapping into dark forces to try and protect them, even though that's only going to put them in more danger. Daredevil also goes out of his way to say that Frank isn't acting like himself, especially the fact that he's swinging a sword, and badly too. Oh, Daredevil, you wonderful jerk. As we quickly discover too, Matt didn't come here just to talk. After all, Matt had had his own run in being a vessel for the beast, and because of that, he knows a thing or two about the corrupting nature of its power. That's why Matt has come here to have a full-on exorcism of Frank Castle. Yeah, he pulls out a little silver cross and starts saying the Lord's Prayer, and not the English version. I'm talking the hardcore Latin, Nomine Patris Spiritus Sanctus, get behind me, Satan. It's actually super awesome. How has Daredevil not done more exorcism stories before? It actually fits him incredibly well, and no, the irony isn't lost on anyone that Daredevil is doing this well dressed as the devil. Now, back in Maria's flashbacks, things continue to unfurl between her and Frank. She talks him into maybe seeing the priest and doing a confession, only to have the priest so utterly horrified by what Frank has to say. Frank almost ends up opening up to her about the man he killed when he was only a boy, and Maria begins to wonder if Frank ran away to battle not because he loved war, but because he was trying to get away from his own war at home. Daredevil's exorcism gambit ultimately ends up failing, as Frank says, do I look like a man possessed? Do I look like a man not doing everything I want to do? He also just happens to be flying as well, which really ends up putting Matt at a loss for words. He had been a vessel for the Beast before, but even he didn't get these kind of powers. Frank lets Matt leave that day, but it's made abundantly clear that these two are going to be clashing again much sooner rather than later. But how exactly are things with Frank and Maria here in the present? The answer is not great. She's getting a little stronger and her memories are starting to come back, which means it's probably only a matter of time before she remembers why Frank is called the Punisher in the first place, because, well, her and the kids died and there was nothing he could do about it, and that their resurrection came about because of unholy ninja magic. That means Frank has to rush to try and finish his work before the nasty truth is ultimately revealed, and he better hurry too, as the god of war Ares, who ultimately won their last fight but not by enough, has come to the Hand's Hidden Valley making use of his brand new dogs of war. Yes, that's right, captured hand ninjas who he's turned into mindless servants. So then, as the issue opens up, we're treated once again to another one of Maria Castle's almost certainly doctored and definitely unreliable narrator flashbacks. For a change though, she actually talks about a happy memory, a day when Frank piled all of them in the car and took them to the park. Yes, that park, but this isn't that fateful day where they all end up shot. Maria says that Frank actually was making a real effort to try and connect to the rest of them and move beyond the horrors of war, but unfortunately it was short-lived and he ended up falling back into old patterns basically right after. In fact, we get to see Maria and Frank at couples counseling, which, man, the Punisher in a therapist's office is just a really interesting image. Frank doesn't have much to add to the conversation about his behavior and his mental state, though he does go out of his way to correct the therapist when she says that he's a soldier. Oh no, I'm a Marine, you see, there's a difference. Now back in the present, the Punisher is going about his merry business of punishing those he has found guilty. However, this ritualistic slaughter ends up getting interrupted by one of the hand ninjas telling Frank that Ares and his army have made their way into the forest outside Hand HQ and are headed for them. The Archpriestess isn't worried, saying that the forest is magical and no one can find their way to the temple unless they've already been here once before. Of course, we as the reader are well aware that Ares has kidnapped a bunch of hand ninjas and is using them as war dogs. The Archpriestess wants to send their forces to go meet Ares head on, while the Punisher feels differently, instead saying that they should wait and fight Ares here on the temple grounds where they'll have home field advantage. You know, it's classic Art of War stuff. The Archpriestess also very loudly questions the Punisher's leadership, not wanting to lose him considering that he almost died during his last battle with Ares, only for Frank to totally shut her down, saying that, hey, I'm the leader, I'm the High Slayer, I'm the fighter here, and also we haven't seen you in the battlefield once. In fact, just to prove how far Frank has come along in his training and mastering the demonic powers of the Beast, Frank lets loose all of those criminals that he was executing and takes them all on single-handedly. It seems that we can now add healing and superhuman durability to Frank's ever-growing list of Beast-related powers. Now, while all that is going on, we see Maria is actually up from her chambers and walking around the Hand Temple. She finds the Punisher body armor and a bunch of guns, and slowly but surely her memories all start coming back. This is of course very bad for the High Priestess, who needs Maria to be as ignorant of everything as humanly possible so that she can continue to control Frank through her. Maria also isn't taking her medicine anymore, and for a second there she starts to wonder where her children have gone, and she almost has the word Punisher on her lips too before the High Priestess knocks her out. We also get another flashback to a night wherein both Maria and Frank woke up with guns hearing noises outside. This is played off as a sweet moment of the two actually finding a moment of understanding between the two of them, and yet when the camera pulls back we can see there's a bunch of hand ninjas outside their window, which again is an interesting bit of artistic license because we know full well that these are doctored memories from an unreliable narrator, and I like the idea that the hand is literally hanging out around the periphery of these memories. Now, as Frank gathers his men for war, he asks specifically for the hand ninjas who had their families murdered by the Archpriestess to stand by him as his honor guard. He swears to them that what happened to them is an unforgivable crime, and should they choose to stand by him today, he will do everything in his power as High Slayer to make sure that their killer is punished and that their families are avenged, because today they're not just fighting for the Beast, they're fighting for the Punisher. And you know what? They seem to be super into it too. I like the idea that the hand hasn't just rubbed off on the Punisher, but the Punisher has rubbed off on the hand ninjas too, giving them something to believe in outside just the Beast. Now that's not all Frank does either. You'll remember that he had lost his last battle with Ares, and during that fight the God of War had crushed his ceremonial dagger, the symbol of the Beast and the High Slayer. Well, to change up his strategy, the
Punisher has taken the broken pieces of that dagger and forged them into bullets for a brand new beast gun. After all, Frank isn't the greatest swords master out there, but he certainly can put a bullet between someone's eyes from far out. In fact, as the comic comes to a close, the Punisher meets Ares at the gates of the temple, saying that gods don't win wars, but bullets do. So then, as we join the book, we actually see Daredevil Matt Murdock having a conversation with a shadowy figure who is later revealed to be Wolverine. Matt wonders what the superhero community is going to do about the growing threat of the Punisher, once the world's greatest killer, now in charge of the greatest cult of killers the world has ever seen. Obviously, this event happens before what's going on in the main Daredevil book right now, because Matt doesn't have a new costume or a beard or being on the Avengers' own shit list. Now, from there, we actually check back on in with Frank. When the last issue ended, he had melted down the Beast dagger and turned it into magical demon bullets to use against the followers of Ares. It's a truly chaotic battle, with both sides giving it absolutely everything they got. Frank lost in their last meetup, and because of that, everything is kinda riding on this rematch. But believe it or not, the big fight between Ares and the Punisher is actually secondary to what's going on in the background, mainly more stuff with Maria Castle. We're treated to a bunch of her internal monologue this issue, which actually I think only 9 issues in makes her the very first character of whom we get to hear what they're actually thinking for once. She talks about sometimes how in her most secretive of moments she would actually sneak away to the vet bars and listen to all the drunken former soldiers talk about their time in the service, waiting for them to eventually tell Frank Castle stories. Apparently they all talked about him and his war exploits in very hushed tones, like they were in awe, like they were in the presence of God on Earth. It got to the point where Maria actually started to worry a little bit. Geez, is War the other woman in her husband's life? A mistress that she should be jealous of? Or is it the other way around? Is Maria the other woman and War is Frank's one and only true first love? It's also here too, I think the narrative actually begins to eat its own tail a little bit. Of course, if you've been paying attention, you'll know all throughout this series, characters like Lady Deathstrike have been implying that the Archpriestess actively doctored Frank's own memories of his life in an attempt to make him more malleable to coming and leading the hand. Doing things this way also basically gave Jason Aaron the ultimate storytelling out, wherein he was free to more or less craft his own continuity for the Punisher and not have to step on the toes of anything that came before. Though here it gets kind of confusing because we see the Archpriestess and the Hand in a flashback that would seek to imply that not everything we've seen up until now is a complete fabrication. It seems that the Hand ninjas have been spying on the Castle family, and it would appear that Frank is actually making a real go at being a husband and father, at reacclimating himself to society away from war and being a soldier. So much to the point that some of the ninjas say, hey, maybe we should just kill his family in the park one day. That'll push him over the edge and make him the high slayer we need him to be. Thankfully, they do not go there, as the Archpriestess says that that would be wrong and that all they need to do is be patient in the Beast to deliver their champion to them. Though, interestingly enough, this also implies that the Archpriestess is one hell of a hypocrite, what with the whole bringing Maria back in the first place as a zombie and doctoring Frank's memories to be everything she wants him to be. Maybe she doesn't actually believe in the Beast as much as she lets on, or maybe this is one of those situations where the Beast helps those who help themselves kind of thing. Now back at the battle, the Punisher actually ends up getting the upper hand on Ares, who once again actually continues to claim that he's fighting for the betterment of Frank, that the Punisher was the perfect instrument of war once upon a time. Pure, unmoored, and uncomplicated, and that all Ares wants to do is see the natural order return to. Though Ares ultimately won't live long enough to see that natural order return to at all, because the Punisher is actually able to kill the God of War, stripping his old skull logo from his body while he did so. But once again, Ares surprises us with his reaction. He's not mad at all to be killed by the Punisher. He's actually overjoyed. Why? Well, because we're playing by necromonger rules on this one. You are what you kill, and with the Punisher killing the God of War, he now is the new God of War. Even though he's also supposed to be the chosen champion of the Beast and the Hand, I guess Ares assumes that two gods can't play nice at the same time, and that it's probably only a matter of time before the Punisher ends up committing a little deicide on the Beast. Now, while the Archpriestess wants to go and meet Frank after the battle, she ends up getting stopped by the Hand ninjas, who are directed by, get this, Maria. In the last issue, we actually saw her start walking around the Hand compound, and it looks like she herself had a one-on-one audience with the Beast statue. And it would appear she's come away with one hell of a religious awakening, no longer
does she fear her husband's warmongering ways. Now she only wants to help feed the beast in him, but wait, this can't possibly be the real Maria anymore, right? This has to be the monster that the Hand and the Archpriestess created, right? Well, we don't 100% get an answer on that, but as the comic comes to an end, we actually check on in with the Sanctum Sanctorum, where a bunch of Avengers have come together to try and solve the riddle of Frank Castle and what should be done about the Punisher who just became a god. Frank was always a thorn in the side of the superhero community, but now his thorn has grown so large and so sharp it might very well bleed the entire world. So then, at the end of the previous issue, Frank Castle had managed to slay the god of war in unlocking new superpowers and bringing himself ever closer to the beast while also making himself the brand new god of war. How is Frank choosing to use those brand new powers? Well, get this. Frank's on a full-blown world tour now, taking down some of the worst who viewed themselves absolutely untouchable, like the sex trafficker with a private jet that he used. To avoid legal jurisdiction, Frank turned this guy into frickin' confetti up in the air and watched it all rain down. Then, of course, there's the case of the super yacht parked outside of Madripoor that would host crazy parties by the most successful and brutal cartel leaders the world had ever known. I say known past tense because they are all no more. How did Frank get to them? Oh, you know, just walk on water, of course. I hear all the cool gods are doing it this time of year. Now, what about the case of Maria Castle? At the end of the last issue, she had seemingly shown her true colors, overtaking the Archpriestess and joining Frank at his side. And that's still pretty much the case now, but Maria holds out hope that with Frank's amazing new powers, he'll be able to finally finish his killer crusade and come home to her once and for all. Though, as has sadly always been the case in their marriage, Frank seems more dedicated to the concept of war and bloodshed than he does his own wife. Also, the Archpriestess isn't gone either. Her place within the Hand may very well have been diminished by Maria, but she still needs to stick around long enough to administer Maria's life-saving shots. Which is just one of the many reasons the Archpriestess feels pretty comfortable that she'll be here indefinitely, though Maria swears that if she's gonna have to put up with this crap, she's at least gonna get to the bottom of why all of her memories just stop at a certain point and why her children haven't seemed to rejoin her and Frank just yet. Oh boy, that is a scab you don't want to pick, lady. Now, as with all the other issues, we're treated to a series of flashbacks from Maria's point of view. Apparently, there came a point when her and Frank actually considered having another baby. One that wouldn't be touched by the specter of war, PTSD, and trauma. Of course, in order to do all that, Frank is going to have to pick up a second job, or at least he tells his wife he's picked up a second job. In reality, he's going out at night and watching executions at Rikers Island. As Maria puts it, this is basically the Frank Castle equivalent of her catching him with another woman. In this case, the other woman is death incarnate. Now, back in the present, Maria actually makes an ultimatum to Frank, saying that he shouldn't come back until he's finally done his work and they can finally be together again no matter how long it takes and no matter what he has to do. And indeed, Frank has only been escalating over the past couple weeks and months, and with this ultimatum thrown his way, he's more than ready to crank it up to 11, starting with a full-scale invasion of Bugalia. You all remember Bugalia, right? That sovereign nation founded by the Masters of Evil, a safe haven for terrorists and supervillains alike? Well, the Punisher goes totally nuclear on the place, glassing it as if he was some sort of vengeful Old Testament god. He's also not shy about showing his face when he does all of this either, meaning the world can no longer deny, including the Avengers, that Frank Castle has changed. He's something new, different, more terrifying. Also, according to a little news blurb, it's after this newest attack, counterfeit Punisher logo merchandise sells out all over the world. Well, geez, Jason, now you're just saying the quiet part loud. We're also not quite done with our flashback either. Apparently, Maria went out of her way to try and confront Frank after witnessing one of these Rikers Island executions at a local vet bar. However, she picked a hell of a night to come and visit, as it was on that most faithful of nights, a drunken, obnoxious Blackwater mercenary decided to start running his mouth to Frank about how cool war is and how war crimes feel awesome and how none of the books and movies about war ever seem to get that part right. Understandably, Frank beats this dude within an inch of his life, which is honestly a pretty interesting character piece. I think Frank is less mad at this dude for what he said and more mad about what he is, a mercenary who gets paid to go to war, gets paid to kill. For Frank, it's never been about the money, it's been about something deeper, more primal, something that he can't quite shake no matter how hard he tries. It's on this night too, Maria has a bit of an awakening about herself. She says that it was in that moment, in all of his bloodlust and fury, that Maria truly saw Frank for the first time ever. She also caught a glimpse of the Punisher, the man he would become, but only when her and the kids were no longer there to get in Frank's way. While back in the present, the Punisher readies for one last push. Apparently, using the sight of the Beast, Frank was able to uncover a Kansas-based supremacist homegrown terrorist group before they could actually act on carrying out any of their evil deeds. For the Archpriestess, this is a moment of much celebration, because in doing so, Frank has unlocked the final power of the Beast. Now he truly sees the world as their God always intended, with man just being simple hunks of rotting meat with their own deepest, darkest sins on their lips. But moreover than that, though, now the Punisher is actually able to kill people not just for the crimes they committed, but the crimes they will one day commit. Like this little boy right here who pulled a gun on Frank. He lived his whole life in this supremacist group, and on his lips he says that one day he will kill in the name of hate. And all the Punisher has to do is strike this kid down, and his final sacrament with the Beast will be complete. He will finally become the King of Killers, the Hands High Slayer, the Red Priest of Blood. Only when the fateful moment comes, Frank opts not to do it. He danced all the way up into that line, but ultimately chose to back off. Apparently even someone like him who's in this deep also still remembers what is right and what is wrong, and Frank doesn't want to lose himself completely. I guess there truly are some lines that even the Punisher himself won't cross, and that's what separates him from a straight-up villain. Though, sadly, as the comic comes to a close, this is the perfect example of learning all the right lessons at the worst possible time. You see, Maria finally does manage to stumble upon the room wherein they've been keeping all the failed cloned kids. And she takes it about as well as you would think she would, completely spiraling with her mind utterly broken upon this revelation. But hey, at least things can't get any worse, right? Only they totally do. The Punisher breaks his sword, a symbol of his time in the hand, only to be met by a detachment of Avengers ready to take him down. Alrighty then, so as we rejoin the book, we're treated to another Maria flashback. It's made abundantly clear that this is only a couple weeks before the castle's murder in Central Park, and that things were already heavily deteriorating before the big moment that would tear apart Frank's life forever. A guy makes a pass at Maria at the gun range, a place that Frank used to love, but that he stopped frequenting with his wife because it was too painful to hold a gun and not use it. At least, not the way we all know he wanted to. Maria briefly considers playing into this dude's advances, if only because it would mean a man was actually taking interest in her again. Frank, it seems around that time, was still disappearing at night, but moreover than that, he picked up a brand new obsession. He bought a junker van that he's been fixing up, saying that he plans to take the family on a road trip soon. Though Maria heard him strip and rebuild the engine about a dozen times, meaning that he was really just looking for excuses not to engage with his family. Also, hey, is this the origins of the battle van? I wasn't expecting that. Frank and Maria ultimately do agree, though, to take their children on a trip to the park the following weekend, and well, we all know how that story ends. Now, back in the present, you'll remember that the Punisher had been confronted by the Avengers at the end of the previous issue, and now Doctor Strange is using all of his magical know-how to try and conduct some sort of arcane surgery. He's quite literally cutting the evil out of Frank as if it was tumors. And oh boy, does he have a lot of evil in there right now, so much to the point he's actually able to break out of Doctor Strange's hold and go after the rest of the Avengers. The truly hilarious irony in all of this is that if you remember from the last issue, Frank had already had an epiphany. He had already begun rebuking the Beast. But of course, the Avengers can't hear any of that, and even if they did, they wouldn't believe him because, geez, look at him, he's flying around, he's on fire. Does that look like the sort of thing a guy telling the truth and who isn't controlled by an evil ancient demon would do? Nah, of course not. We get treated to another flashback where we learn that Maria actually hired a private investigator to follow her husband at night. Frank had caught wind of this and threatened the man's life, saying that he better just tell his wife he's having an affair, because in reality, the truth that he just goes back to his old neighborhood, sits on the roof that he watched those people get murdered at as a child, would honestly be way more devastating for his wife to hear right now. Hell, it would make more sense too. Maria even says in her internal monologue, maybe she lost Frank a long time ago. Maybe the reason he's so cold and detached right now is because he's depressed. Sad that he'll never really live up to his true potential as the ultimate killing machine. Now back at the fight for Frank's soul, Jason Aaron actually goes out of his way to lean on his old Doctor Strange work. Steven reads the the Punisher the riot act, saying that he has no idea what dipping his toes into magic means. That all magic, even the Beast's dark magic, has some sort of equivalent exchange attached to it, and that Doctor Strange has been running around trying to fix all the horrors that the Punisher's bloody crusade has wrought, be it children born with horns threatening to kill their own mothers, or monks in Poland who have their faces boiled and melted off. Other Avengers members get their chance to jaw-jack with Frank for a little bit too. I particularly enjoy Moon Knight saying he knows a thing or two about being a leg breaker for a god, and that ultimately it's never worth it. Hell, Mark Spector killed his god, and if he can do that, they probably weren't much of a deity to begin with. Let's try and kill your god and see what happens. Even Black Widow gets in on the action too, which is pretty interesting considering that in tone she's probably the closest to Punisher than anyone else on the Avengers team. She also helped him escape at the end of the Rosenberg series, though I don't think Jason Aaron remembers that. Captain America, of course, really steals the show by telling Frank to stand down, Marine, your war is over. Can't you see we're all just trying to save your soul, soldier? Only for Frank to once again call upon the power of the Beast, saying that he always knew where he was going when he dies because, well, Frank Castle's soul was spoken for a very long time ago. And it's right around here that all of these different storylines finally start dovetailing together. In the past, we see that fateful day in the park where Maria and the kids were murdered, only now it's revealed that before the gangland bullets started flying, Maria was actually about to ask Frank for a divorce, wanting to take the kids away from him, fearing what he might do either to himself or to someone else. While in the present, Maria gets one of the hand ninjas to take her to the archive room, wherein she finally reads up on the Punisher and sees everything that her husband did in her name and the name of her children after they died. And unsurprisingly, Maria doesn't exactly love the idea that Frank was willing to fill entire graveyards worth of dead, all to try and balance the scales of their murder. Perhaps on some level the Punisher was always inevitable. Perhaps Maria had always been lying to herself. All she knows for sure, though, is that when Frank eventually does make it back to the Hand HQ, bloody and beaten from his battle with the Avengers, all she can see is the Beast, a beast that she must destroy. And as the comic comes to an end, Maria turns the very same gun that Frank used to kill Ares against him. So then, picking up directly from where the last issue had left off, the Punisher had finally made his choice to renounce the Beast and his amazing powers, only to be fatally shot by his wife Maria, who had finally fully realized all of the horrible things that Frank had done in her name and the names of their children since their deaths. I had assumed this big final issue was going to be about a confrontation between Frank and Maria, and ultimately it kind of is, but for this moment she's decided to slink away again. It's here Frank is once again met by the Hand Archpriestess, who uses this moment of weakness to once again try and re-establish control over the Hand, which she was quickly losing to Frank. The Archpriestess says that she's disappointed in Frank turning away from the light of the Beast by choosing not to kill that boy and then ultimately choosing not to kill the Avengers, who are actually hot on his tail and are going to be kicking down the door to this monastery any minute now, but she's not surprised. She does the whole bad guy monologue thing for a bit, saying that maybe at the end of the day Frank Castle has always been too simple to see the bigger picture, and that a killer with a conscience, a killer with rules and lines he refuses to cross, well, that's just no good for her, but maybe if she can kill Frank with his own god gun, she'll just bring him back as a Hand zombie and have a second crack at this. After all, it's like the priestess says, she never assumed that Frank Castle was just going to ride off with his wife into the sunset. It's at that moment there the Punisher reveals that he actually kept just enough beast power to royally knock the crap out of the Archpriestess. Not enough to kill her, mind you, she actually slinks away as well and is implied to be a threat for another day. All of this really takes it out of Frank, and by the time he comes to, he's actually a prisoner in the basement of the Sanctum Sanctorum. It seems that Doctor Strange and the others have taken him back to New York to, well, get this, stand trial for his evil doings. Yes, that's right, everyone. What we're witnessing here is the long-awaited, much-touted final punishment of Frank Castle. Not that Frank himself seems to care all that much. I mean, what does the superhero community expect him to do? Apologize? Say that he was under the control of evil magic, that he'll never do it again? Everyone knows that's a lie. As far as Frank is concerned, the Hand were just another weapon in his vast arsenal, and getting his wife back was icing on top of the cake. In fact, in a real defining moment of characterization, Frank doesn't care at all what they do to him. He only cares that Maria be allowed to keep living and not get put down like some sort of unholy zombie. Now, a really fascinating thing about this issue that that I'm seeing a lot of people miss in other reviews is that for the first time ever in all 12 issues, Frank Castle's own internal monologue returns, meaning we're actually allowed to get inside his head and hear what he's thinking. Meaning that when we once again get a series of flashbacks, we know these 100% happened from Frank's own point of view. We actually pick up with him not long after Maria and the kids' funerals. Where did the man who would be the Punisher go on the saddest day of his life? Well, he walked into a mob bar, of course. Maybe because he wanted to die, maybe because he wanted to kill. It's open for interpretation. But oh, kill he did. He killed and he killed and he never stopped. Now back in the present, all of the different members of this Avengers team come to the basement to have it out with Frank. Wolverine is first in classic Logan fashion. He tries to put the fear into Frank, though that doesn't work. Hell, Frank even calls Wolverine out on his hypocrisy, saying, oh, if you want to kill me and put me down for being such a bad guy, for being such a threat to the public good, you better kill yourself as soon as we're done here. Black Widow is next, and she takes a completely different, completely softer avenue, actually coming at Frank like a friend. And again, if Frank had any friends in the Marvel Universe, it would probably be Nat, someone he fought back-to-back with, bled with. But oh, Frank Castle has no time for friends, no time for family, no time for anything but his mission. And again, for the second time in this whole mock trial, Frank cares not about himself, but wants the heroes to make sure that Maria will be safe. Perhaps the strangest yet most weirdly compelling juror in this trial is actually Moon Knight. In the previous issue, Mark Spector talked about knowing a thing or two about being slave to a crappy god. And here, once again, Moon Knight actually meets the Punisher with a certain level of sympathy. After all, Mark knows a thing or two about being sick in the head, battling invisible demons, dealing with trauma. And I mean, yeah, I guess it makes sense for someone like Moon Knight to be so sympathetic and think that there's light in everyone and that anyone can change. He's certainly changed a lot over the years. Frank's reaction to this, too, is really compelling as well. He argues with everyone else, but he doesn't argue with Moon Knight. In fact, he doesn't say a single word while Spectre does his whole speechifying. It's also around here, too, we're treated to our final flashback. We're told in the monologue how Frank went out of his way to execute every single person involved with his family's death, no matter how minuscule. He killed them all within the span of just a few months, and the last guy who was left he got right before the lethal injection. Yeah, that's right, the Punisher broke into a prison to kill a guy even though he was about to be executed by the state. Even Frank himself has to admit there's something deeply sick and wrong about that. He could have just sat by and this guy would have died anyway, but that's not who Frank is. He's not that scared little boy from the rooftop all those years ago. Frank Castle is many things, but what he is a man who refuses to just sit idly by anymore. Now, the final juror, Frank is pretty sure is going to be Captain America. He's going to read him the riot act and make him feel really bad about himself, but no, to his shock and surprise, his final juror is actually Maria herself. Apparently, the Archpriestess had been lying about the whole she can't leave the palace or else she'll slowly deteriorate. Doctor Strange fixed her right up, and now she's finally ready to have her last words with Frank, to have the words that she wanted to have with him all those years ago before the shooting. As Maria puts it, it's not the mob, it's not the bullets who took his family away from him. Frank did it with his own behavior many years before that fateful day in the park. And ever since then, all he's done is use his family as justification for the rivers of blood that he's spilled all across the world. And frankly, Maria's done with it. She's been given a second chance at life. And she's actually really going to live it. And you know what? Frank is going to bankroll it too. With the help of Black Widow, they actually managed to put together some sort of crazy superhero divorce settlement. All of Frank's assets, which mostly just included safe houses and weapons, have all been sold. Maria's keeping half of it, which is a considerable amount, and the rest is being donated to children's charity in the names of the kids. As Maria puts it, if he really wanted to honor them, that's what he always should have done from the start. And yeah, it's after that she leaves him crushed and broken, having lost everything that he thought he was fighting for this whole time. And yet, in a weird way, this is bittersweet. This is the best way any of this could have turned out. Maria will be allowed to live. The sins of the Punisher will not fall on her head, but what about Frank's sins? Well, he's not ready to actually hear what the jury of his peers has to say. Instead, he grabs those two beast bullets that Doctor Strange had pulled out of him, believing that they had enough residual dark energy to allow him one last spell. And with that, the Punisher just kind of poofs. As Doctor Strange says it, he's completely gone from existence, which is not the same as dead, but it's pretty close. But wait, don't worry, the story isn't done yet, as we're actually treated treated to 3 very unexpected epilogues. One actually sees Maria leaving New York and her old life behind with Frank's money, but also a positive pregnancy test. Oh no. We also cut back all the way to issue 1, wherein the Archpriestess first made her devil's deal to Frank. In the beginning, Punisher wanted nothing to do with this version of his wife, thinking that she was some sort of unholy zombie. He was gonna blow the resurrected Maria away until she started talking, saying that she can't remember much, but she remembers that Frank, despite all of his flaws, always kept her and the children safe. It was the most endearing thing about him, and in a way, he kind of got to do it all over again. But wait, there's more. From there, we actually flash on over to Weird World. That crazy Doug Monick Conan the Barbarian fantasy dimension. We see that Frank is actually alive and well and protecting a group of lost children. They ask him his name, and he doesn't say the Punisher, he says Frank. Perhaps implying that maybe, just maybe, Frank Castle can learn to live without the Punisher as the comic comes to a close. And so that was Punisher issue number 12, everybody, and oh boy, was this really a grand finale. I didn't know what I was expecting going into this one, and I gotta say, Aaron really did flip the script on me in the best way possible. In fact, this final issue basically confirms everything that I'd been saying from the very beginning. Frank's life is a tragedy, and this newest chapter in his story is maybe one of the most tragic yet. He was so close to almost winning his war on crime, and all it cost him was his soul. He finally got to see his wife again, but it was all twisted and wrong. Personally, I like that they leave the verdict on the final punishment of Frank Castle vague. Honestly, in my own mind, I like to think that because he stayed so true to his wife and trying to protect her, the superhero community would have gone easy on him. But because Frank is Frank and he refuses to answer to anyone, and because he refuses to stand idly by, he just chose to go to Weird World than deal with any of the fallout. There are a few superhero stories that truly, really organically feel like the final word on a character, and honestly, this does feel like Aaron's final word on the Punisher. Obviously, I don't think it's the last we're ever gonna see of Frank. He's too popular to lay low forever, but I think as far as swan songs go, this was a pretty damn good one. Overall, I would give it a 9 out of 10.